All right, looks like I got several people out there, okay? And we are going to get this party started. If you don't know who I am the Reverend Dave Nelson. I am the charismatic and inspirational leader over at Industry Cooking Channel at YouTube, okay? I got a ton of cooking videos over there. I'm preaching the good word of the kitchen. It's not what it sounds like. It's not weird in a preachy way, but it's kind of awesome because we're laying down essential kitchen wisdom that everybody can use every day in their kitchens. And that's what I'm doing. I got tons of stuff to go over. I'm kind of doing a little bit of a introduction to baking stuff today. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some background stuff, but really I have to make a confession here. I have kind of lured you in under false pretenses. This is a biscuit class, but I got you here with biscuits, but it's really about a method, okay? And the method today, it's a mixing method. The method today is the cut-in method. That's what I really want you to walk away knowing backward and forward when we get done with this class today, okay? And so that's what it's all about, the cut-in method. Several things I'm gonna go over. I'll give you a little recipe, the ingredients and all that good stuff. But I'm also gonna kind of go over scaling, okay? The process of weighing out your ingredients. We're gonna talk about recipes and the accuracy of recipes. And we're gonna talk a little bit about the metric system. It kind of works well in the kitchen if you want accuracy. And so we'll talk about that. We're going to be talking about different flours, okay? When we're making biscuits using this cut-in method, we're typically talking about kind of a low gluten flour, very little gluten in there. Other preparations that we use, other flours that you use have more gluten. So we're going to discuss different types of flours because it's kind of hard to understand what's going on in a biscuit recipe if you don't understand what's going on with the flours and gluten development and things like that. So we're going to go through all of that stuff. We're going to bang out some biscuits and demonstrate the cut-in method. This cut-in method, by the way, we see this in anything that's flaky, a lot of things that are flaky, right? Like things like flaky pie dough, biscuits, of course, scones, some of your shortbread cookies and things like that. Anything where we're generating some flakes in there, we're typically using the cut-in method. Okay, and so other classes, by the way, we'll be talking about other mixing methods. That's kind of how I look at baking. If I know those base techniques behind the recipe, the secrets behind the recipe, hey, I can kind of maneuver in the kitchen pretty quickly and easily if I understand those dynamics. So that's what it's all about, okay? So we're gonna talk about the flour, we're gonna make some biscuits, we're gonna demonstrate that cut-in method, we're gonna bake them, and while those are baking, I wanna kind of talk about some more introductory baking theory, okay? We're gonna talk about leavening agents, okay? When we're talking about leavening, we are talking about whatever is making your bread or baked product rise, okay? We're gonna kind of talk about those dynamics. So that'll give us a little conversation while biscuits are cooking, and then we'll see the biscuits come on out. And gosh, I made a little pot of chili yesterday, and I'm just gonna have some chili and biscuits today. Let's go ahead and get started. I got several people out there. Again, thanks for joining me, guys. I have a blast with this, and it is my happy hour for the week, okay? So thanks for joining, and I'm just gonna have a little shot of sunshine, and we'll get going on this. Cue the band. We get the band going here. All right. So you're going to see me start scaling out ingredients here, and I should really talk about that first, okay? Whenever we are working in a professional kitchen, you will never, ever see a recipe with, like, you know, when you're weighing dry ingredients, you'll never see a recipe where I am weighing out like cups of flour or cups of sugar or anything like that. We always use weights in a professional kitchen. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If I had 5 different cooks lined up in a kitchen and I asked each one of them to give me a cup of flour, and then we put all of those cups on a scale, I'm going to get 5 different weights. It's pretty obvious, right? And so if I go by weight, every one of those cooks, if I need 4 ounces of flour or a cup of flour or 8 ounces of flour, ostensibly, every one of those cooks are going to give me 8 ounces every single time if they know how to use their scale. Okay, so Personally, I feel so strongly about this. I consider it a disservice to hand anybody a recipe or to teach a class and give anybody a recipe where the dry ingredients are in cup measurements or volume measurements. That's what I kind of mean. We don't use these, okay? And so you're going to see me weigh everything, well, in weights, okay? Let's just put it like that, okay? We're going to weigh everything out. And we call this process scaling in the kitchen. Now, another thing I want to kind of talk about in the kitchen is, or really in the bake shop, is the metric system really helps in the bake shop. I use an electronic scale, okay, and I can set this thing to weigh grams, and it will give me an exact amount. And the reason this is so good is because when I start getting into small ingredients that we use small amounts of, like say salt, baking soda, baking powder, little amounts like that. If I'm trying to use volume measurements like teaspoons, tablespoons, it's really hard to get accuracy. It's hard to cut that recipe in half or you know, anything like that, right? And so if I can use a metric system, if I can get metric amounts and use that on an electronic scale, I'm going to be able to weigh it by the gram, very, very tiny amounts. So I can get some real accuracy in those recipes. So I have to say most of the professional bakers that I know, we're not using the American or avoirdupois or whatever system you want to call that, okay? We're going metric in a lot of those professional kitchens, okay? It's just, we gave it up a little while ago. Okay, so that's what you're going to see me do. Okay, I should talk about recipes in general. In the bake shop, we tend to call them formulas, and it's very, very important that once we get a formula that works for us, we are going to follow it consistently as far as like amounts and things like that. And also we're going to follow the technique consistency, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, the technique. Let me back up a little bit. Sorry, we were talking about recipes versus formulas, and when we are in a bake shop, we tend to call them formulas because the accuracy is so crucial. Like I said, we're using metric amounts, grams of things and everything. And so we tend to use that term in the bake shop. Again, really not about a recipe so much. It's about getting exact ingredients that kind of work for you and then applying technique to it. I should say that if you are a pastry chef that is working in Sacramento, I'm in Sacramento right now, if you don't know that. If I'm a pastry chef in one city, I'm going to get a recipe that works for me. I'm going to have to do troubleshooting and kind of figure things out. Nothing ever works straight out of the book. So I'm going to have to do a little troubleshooting. I'll make that recipe my own so I can nail it every time consistently. If I move to another town, say Lake Tahoe or the elevation, I'm up at elevation now, all of my ingredients are off. All my recipes are off. I have to retool all of my recipes. If I move to Miami Beach where it's humid, all of my ingredients have more liquid or moisture in them, so they all weigh differently. I have to completely retool all of my recipes. So moral of the story is recipes are, they're not a perfect system. They are a starting point. It's a good idea as you get into cooking to understand your ingredients and what they do when you say add liquid to them or apply heat to them, and know how they act under different conditions, right? And once you kind of understand ingredients behind baking and pastry, you can really develop your own recipes and troubleshoot. You can look at, say, a cookie coming out of the oven and it's all flat and it's like, you know, really spread out, and it's like, oh, either too much fat or too much sugar, right? I got too much spread out of it. That's what they call it, right? Or if the cookie is like, it gets really, really puffed up and then cracks and then kind of falls or whatever, oh, wow, there's probably too much baking soda or something like that, right? So understanding ingredients in baking and pastry is really, really important. And that's like a whole section in culinary school. We spend about a week going over milk and eggs and all of that different stuff, right? And so it's fascinating stuff, right? So that's kind of the scaling business and everything. Before I get into scaling, let's talk a little bit about flours, because, you know, if you're new at cooking, if you're new in the bake shop, you don't really understand all of these different flours in the kitchen, bread and high gluten, what's the difference, you know, and pastry versus cake, right? And so let's kind of talk about some of the different flours in the kitchen. Just really what I want to do is kind of differentiate different gluten content, right? When we're looking at all of these flours, mostly what we're looking for, if it's all wheat flours, I should say, mostly what we're looking at is gluten content there. And sometimes we want a lot of gluten content, like if I'm making pasta dough, if I'm making crusty bread where I really want to knead it and develop that crust on the outside. Other things, I don't want gluten in them, right? And it's not for allergies or anything like that. It's because that gluten makes my products tough. If you bake a cake, you don't want a very glutinous flour for it, because that cake is going to be really rubbery. That gluten is very elastic. It won't allow it to really open up and rise in the oven. So we want a very, very low gluten flour for things like cake, things like pastries, pie dough, right? You don't want a high gluten flour for pastry doughs, pie doughs, things like that, because it's going to be really, really tough and chewy, right? And so, starting at the bottom, cake flour is usually the flour that has the least amount of gluten in it. So it's mostly starch. We're all talking about kind of a gluten starch ratio here, right? And so cake flour would be the first flour, or the lowest in gluten, okay? moving up in the scale, pastry flour would be the next one. And pastry flour, you know, if you're not familiar, we're using that in things like to make things like laminated doughs, puff pastry and pie doughs and tart doughs and things like that. Short dough cookies, things like that. Pastry flour is great for that stuff. And by the way, I didn't mention cake flour is used for, you know, cakes, right? Very light, airy, tender crust, tender crumb. That's what we always kind of talk about, okay? We got some people rolling in. Thanks for joining me for happy hour, guys. Let's do another one of these. I'm talking about flour right now. We just talked about kind of low gluten flours or high starch flours, the cake flour and the pastry flour. Next, we'll have all-purpose flour. We're kind of getting up there in the amount of gluten, okay? And all-purpose is just what it sounds like. It's supposed to be something that, you know, your average person can kind of throw some baked goods together in the kitchen, all-purpose, right? But it's not your perfect flour for every use. There is no real all-purpose flour. Let me do one of these. Oh, look at all these loves. Sending a lot of love. I love it, guys. So that was all-purpose flour. Now we're moving up in the scale. Next, we're getting into bread flour, okay? And this is, we want crusty bread. We want to be able to knead that bread. The more we knead bread, the more we develop gluten chains. When I think of gluten, I think of a barrel of monkeys, right? And the monkeys all kind of hook up together. And the more I knead that dough, the longer and longer chain of monkeys will hook up. And those are my gluten strands. The more gluten I develop in a product, the chewier it's going to be, the more elastic. I can develop too much gluten, where if I have yeast in a baked product or something, it can't rise because there's too much gluten development. You know, so you guys get the idea, right? High gluten bread flour is one of those high gluten flours, and then we get into high gluten flour, which is in, you know, really chewy breads. Like I think of bagels all the time when I'm thinking of high protein flour, high gluten flour. I should also mention whole wheat flour, okay? And so whole wheat flour is kind of in that all-purpose kind of range, okay? Except that whole wheat flour contains the bran and the germ. And those pieces of bran and germ are like little razor blades in there, basically, and they will slice through your gluten chains. Or they really, to put it another way, they won't allow the monkeys to link up because there's little pieces of bran in between the monkeys, okay? So that barrel of monkeys can't create long gluten strands in there. Whole wheat flours, it's very difficult to get much gluten development in a whole wheat flour. We tend to add other bread flour into that to kind of compensate for that. Okay, so that's just in a nutshell. Okay, just barely talking about those flours, the different flours in the kitchen. But it's kind of good to know if you've never heard this stuff before. It's that idea of, you know, cake pastry, those are your low gluten flours. Bread, high protein flours, those are your high gluten flours, and then your all-purpose is kind of right in the middle. Okay, and so that's what I wanted to talk about with flour. All right, and so the next thing I want to do is get into our cut-in method. And before we do that, we're going to have to scale. Okay, now I mentioned that I'm using an electronic scale. This dude was like 10 or 13 bucks online. You know, get on Amazon, get you one of these if you don't have one. If you want to play with baking, you will thank yourself if you get one of these. And if you're trying to bake with, like, you know, a half cup of this and a cup of that, you're just never going to get consistency out of that. You get a scale, you get a recipe, you troubleshoot your recipe, and it's going to work for you every single time. Okay, this is very important for my students going out there in the professional world. Okay, all right. So when I am using this scale, there's a button on there, the power button. It says tare. Gosh, I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can see that. Okay, tare. And what that means is it's going to zero out my scale no matter what's on here. Okay, so in other words, I got a bowl here that I'm going to use later on. And I place the bowl on there, and I only want to weigh the ingredient that's going in this bowl, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to press tare, and it's automatically going to zero that out. When I weigh the next thing, it might be flour or something like that. Now my bowl weighs a different weight, and I just want to weigh the flour. So I'm going to hit tare again, and that's going to zero my scale out when that bowl is on there. Okay, and so tare is a very important thing to know about. Also, I think I'm going to use my metric measurements here, okay, just to get everybody used to that. And really, as long as you're not like trying to convert a recipe or something like that, metric, you're just, if it tells you 23 grams, it's 23 grams. It's super easy to do, right? And so I'm going to set it to grams. And we're going to start scaling out some ingredients. Our first ingredient, or our first step I should talk about in our cut-in method, is to blend your dry ingredients. And then what I'm going to do is cut my fat into it. I'll show you what that looks like. And then the third step is you're going to blend your wet ingredients. In this case, I'm going to use buttermilk and a little bit of honey, okay? And then you blend the wet ingredients into the dry with fat, right? And so that's the cut-in method. That's what the whole lesson is today, okay? But for now, I want to do all my dry ingredients together because they're all going to be sifted together, okay? As I do this, when I weigh this out, I tend to set up my bowl with a little sifter in it already, okay? And so I'm scaling right into this. We are talking about scaling 101. This is awesome, okay? I'm gonna start out with a little lightweight stainless steel bowl on my scale. I'm gonna press tare, and I'm gonna zero that baby out. Here, let me kind of move down here. And there's my setup, okay? I've got these nice and close together, so I'm not gonna get flour all over my counter. Let me move things. And the first thing that I'm going to weigh out is my flour. And my pastry flour, for those of you that are going American style, is about 20 ounces. And I'll do an edit and add all this stuff in later, but we're doing about 20 ounces of pastry flour or 600 grams. I've got my scale set to grams, so that's what we're looking at. And I got a big old cup measure here, or half cup measure, because I need a good amount of flour here. Oh gosh. The whole thing just turned off. I got to start over. I'm sorry, everybody. Turn it on. And it's set to grams. Okay, we're going to try that again. Ooh, you bet I'm going to edit that part out. How embarrassing. My scale just turned right off. Okay, it's still working. We're at about 220 right now. So I'm getting about 100 grams each one of these. We're at about 438, and we said we were going for 600 grams here. Going metric. And again, that was 20 ounces of regular kind of pastry flour. That's what I'm using today. Boop, boop. Okay, come on, come on. And what I usually do is overload it, and then I pull it out, okay? So there's $5.99, okay? That's a lot. That's 600 grams right there. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my pastry flour. Get it out of the way. And we're going to go to our other dry ingredients. Now, let me just go ahead and start working this through. I'm going to sift it. In a professional kitchen, we've got giant hoop sifters that work really good for this. I scale right into those. I'll lay out parchment paper, and I'll put the sieve right on top of the paper, and I scale right into that big hoop sifter. And then I pick it up and shake it, and all of my ingredients falls out onto the paper, and then I load the paper. I pour the ingredients right into a big old giant mixer, big old 30-quart or whatever mixer we got. By the way, I should point out, pastry flour, you know you have pastry flour when it clumps in your hand. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but it clumps in your hand when you put a little pressure on it. See those big lumps? Pastry flour and cake flours really clump up. Yeah. Sorry, guys. Let me finish sifting this. That was just a mess trying to show that to you. All right. And I'm going to leave that sifter right on that bowl, and I'm going to weigh out my next ingredient and sift it right into those other ingredients. I started to say that sifting, it's about knocking the lumps out of your ingredients, but it's also about blending your ingredients, right? Distributing ingredients within. I've got baking powder here, right? We're going to be using a very small amount. This baking powder is 1.25 ounces of baking powder, American style. We're going for about 37 grams of this, okay? Now, this is pretty clumped up, and I also don't just want baking powder to stay in one area of my ingredients. So as I sift, it helps me to distribute, like I said. So let me get a spoon for this one. I didn't anticipate that. Bad chef. So I'm going to zero that out. Tare. Got a little flour in there. Okay, it's zeroed out, and we are weighing grams, okay? I said I'm going for 37 grams here. And like I said, I usually kind of go overboard and then take out. It's the fastest way to go. So overload it. Oh gosh, it hit 37 grams, so we'll just pretend to take some out. Boom. But that was that. And I'll get rid of my baking powder. I don't want to weigh it twice. And I'm going to send that on through. And I'm not going to sift all of them at once, or all of them every time. I'm going to do my salt next, okay? And my salt is going to be, let's see, half an ounce of salt, okay? So that's about 13 grams. It's right at 12. I'm just going to give it another little pinch. Let's see, what's a gram look like? There we go. 13 grams. This is super easy. Hey, chef. Nice to see all these chefs out there, by the way. Very, very awesome. Good to see you guys. All right. So we're doing the cut-in method after we get done scaling. Right now, I'm just demonstrating scaling. I have put all of my dry ingredients together in this bowl, okay? I think what I'll do next is go ahead and put my wet ingredients together, okay? So I've got one bowl with dry ingredients. A lot of your baking preparations work like this, setting things aside. Now I'm going to put my wet ingredients together. Now, one of my wet ingredients is going to be buttermilk, and the buttermilk I'm using 13 ounces. And for liquids, I will use volume measurements for liquids. I just don't use them for dry ingredients like sugar and flour and things like that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and go for, let's see, I think I said 13 ounces of buttermilk. So I'm going to weigh that right into here. And there's 12, there's 13 right there. I got some buttermilk. Funky stuff. Anybody drink this stuff? Anybody out there? Okay, so I'm going for 14 ounces of buttermilk here. Or we said 13, sorry. All right, so that's my first wet ingredient. The other wet ingredient is honey. I wanted to show you a trick for using honey because it's such, I'm sorry, I got the camera up here. Honey is such a hassle and to work with because it's so sticky. So I have a little trick that I use for this, okay? I'm gonna put my honey on this bowl on a scale, and I've got the bowl wrapped in plastic wrap. This has a different weight, so I'm gonna re-tear my scale and it's zeroed out again, okay? For my honey, I'm looking for either 1 ounce or 28 grams of honey here, okay? So 1 ounce if you're doing the all-American style. Now this bowl is lined with plastic wrap, and I'm gonna pour the honey into that. And I don't mind getting a little extra honey here, but you don't wanna go crazy. And okay, there it is, okay? So I got my 30, and then what I do is if I'm weighing things out ahead, I can take this honey, twist it up in here, and there I've got my honey weighed out, and then when I need it, I didn't need to do this today, I just twisted it up. I didn't need to do this today, but I wanted to show you this little trick, okay? Now when I do need it, I just grab a little paring knife. Yeah, Roberta's dad, you used to drink your dad used to drink the chunky buttermilk. My grandma always drank that. And I was thinking about it. It's like in the old days, they could culture that milk and it would keep a lot longer. They didn't have refrigeration back then. So they had to figure things out like buttermilk. I think a lot of people were surviving on buttermilk back in the day. Okay, so my 2 liquid ingredients are in there. I'm gonna stir that honey into the buttermilk so it's distributed. And that's kind of a nice little trick for getting honey in a recipe without making too much of a mess, okay? Let's see, the last thing that I'm going to need is my butter, my fat in here. Now, a word about butter and fat and things like that. In these recipes, you have the option of using butter or shortening. Shortening is known for giving you really, really good flakes and things like pie crust and biscuits and things like that. The only thing is butter melts in your mouth and shortening doesn't. So whenever I see a super, super flaky biscuit, I am really kind of cautious about that because when I eat a shortening biscuit, by the way, shortening will make beautiful flakes, right? But when I eat a shortening biscuit, it completely coats my mouth with that shortening. It doesn't melt at body temperature. So you wind up getting this like plastic coating in your mouth is what it feels like to me, right? So I really, really do recommend using butter. You know, a lot of people, I remember this one place I worked at and they used to just brag on the pie dough there. It's so flaky. You know what? I didn't want to touch that stuff with a 10-foot pole. It was just nasty eating that stuff. So I really do recommend butter. Okay, it melts at body temperature. It just goes right on down. Okay, it's not going to coat your mouth or anything. It's a thing. Okay, that was my little rant there. All right. La 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 la. Cue the band. All right, I got to bring out a few tools from the refrigerator. I've been kind of chilling a few things. Okay. So I need 7 ounces of butter here. And I have you know, your standard 4-ounce cubes. So really all I need is a 3-ounce piece of butter because I already got a 4-ounce here and that'll make 7, right? So I'm not going to weigh the whole thing. I'm just going to do a 3-ounce thing. This recommends I just cut it. It's got the little ounce graduations on here. So I'm just going to start there. And I think I put my knife over here. My little beater knife. I'm just going to start there. 2 tablespoons is 1 ounce. And I'm going to see if I got 3 ounces here. Let's take a look. And let's see, my 3 ounces, I didn't do 213 grams. That's not right. 7 ounces of butter. Oh, I know what I'm doing. Here's my 4. That's right. Let me switch this to ounces. Okay, just a little more butter. I cut off a little too much. And it's really not that much in the big scheme of things. But there I have 3 ounces plus 4. And that's a thing. I kind of mentioned this because in the bake shop, I used to use like a counterbalance scale a lot. It's a tool we have. It's not always this electronic stuff. With the counterbalance, sometimes I needed counterweights on there. And if I needed a 1 pound counterweight, hey, grab a block of butter, throw it on there. And that was kind of how I would, you know, use butter in there. So it's kind of important to know, you know, how much your packaging weighs. All right, I'm going to get all the paper off of this and we will have 7 ounces of butter. And we're going to start the cut-in method next, okay? I kind of mentioned earlier that the cut-in method is just one of several different mixing methods that I tend to talk about when I'm teaching baking and pastry, okay? Other mixing methods, there's the straight mix methods. We tend to use the straight mix method when we are using yeast, doing yeast doughs and things like that, okay? Well, it's another class, but the straight mix method, you kind of dissolve yeast in your water and your dry ingredient, and then in your wet ingredient, and then add dry ingredients, and then roll it on up. It's a straight mix, super easy. Some of you have probably heard of the creaming mixing method. We use that with cookies quite a bit, where you cream butter and sugar together. That's another mixing method that's pretty common. A lot of people have heard about that one, okay? So like I said, this cut-in method is just another in a bunch of these different mixing methods that we see in professional bake shops, okay? And once you kind of know the ins and outs of them, you walk in and see a biscuit recipe and it's all, oh, well, this is obviously cut-in method. I'm just going to go for it. I don't need to read the technique anymore, okay? All right, so a couple of tricks with butter. I have my dry ingredients kind of sifted into this bowl, and I'm just going to give them a little stir around because all the baking powder and salt was on top. So now it's fairly distributed. I've knocked out the lumps, basically. And we're talking about the cut-in method. First step, mix dry ingredients or sift dry ingredients together. The next step is to cut the fat into the dry ingredients. What we're doing here is we're putting chunks of fat and coating them with flour. Later on, we break out a rolling pin and flatten those little chunks out, and that little chunk of butter wrapped in flour is going to be a single flake in our biscuit. That's what we're building here, okay? So this is not going to be a smooth mix. We want chunks of fat coated in flour here, and that's kind of the object. One tool that pastry chefs will use is actually a cheese grater, right? The big holes on this thing, they make a really nice flake for your pie dough. So I'm going to do some of it like this, and I'm going to do another with another method, okay? But I'm just going to kind of roll it through. And one thing I need to show you is as you're doing this, you get a little butter down there. I don't want to keep laying butter on top of that butter, so I'll toss a little bit of flour on that and then keep going. Get it? So don't just keep grating butter on top of butter. Keep tossing the flour on it. So all of those little pieces are coated with flour, okay? You just don't have one big lump. Now, I'm not fond of the cheese grater method. I want to show you another method that we use. And I only showed you the cheese grater because some people don't have this next tool, okay? And that tool is what's called a pastry cutter. Now, oh God, this is why I don't like the butter thing, the grater thing. It's just kind of messy. By the way, a little tip for the cheese grater thing, have your butter super, super cold. It was out here while I was talking and everything a little bit, so it kind of makes it a little messier. But if it's super cold, that works really nice for you, okay? Now, I wanted to show you a pastry cutter, and some people will mistakenly call this tool a pastry cutter, but this is called a bench scraper, okay, not a pastry cutter. This is a pastry cutter. It is specifically made for cutting fat into flour for this cut-in method, which is the whole deal today, right? And so that's what we're getting into. Let me set that up there. And with this guy, it's super easy. Oh, by the way, this is also called a pastry blender, okay? Now I have a little grated butter in there, but I'm just gonna get in here and just start cutting using this tool to cut the butter into the fat. And every once in a while now I've cut through there and the cut sides don't have flour on them. So every once in a while I'll kind of toss things around like I was doing with those little flakes I was making. Let me just move one thing for production purposes. My computer's just getting nailed here. Okay, my monitor. All right, so we're in there and I'm just doing the cut-in method. And it's kind of fun to use this guy, actually. It's more fun than grating. I'm gonna give it a little shake. And the object here is, I'm gonna go for about the size of a green pea, okay? I think everybody knows what that looks like. So we're gonna go for pieces like that. Like I said a second ago, this is gonna look a little rough. I could have used a bigger bowl for this recipe, by the way. I wasn't sure about the amount. I think I'm going to switch to one real quick. Pardon me, ladies and gentlemen, but it's just kind of a hassle like this. Just a little too small. I always run into that at culinary school. Students will try and make recipes in these teeny bowls. It's just like, hey, bite the bullet. It's not going to fit. Let's get a bigger bowl. All right, back to it. Now I can kind of move, and I don't have to be quite so careful. I can kind of see the big chunks. This is more like it. This is making more biscuits than I probably need. All right, Ms. Allison's out there. Gosh, I've been seeing her at these things for a while. And you can just see big chunks of fat in there. That's a perfect little piece of fat. That is going to smash down when I roll this out and make a perfect little flake in my biscuits, okay? Cut-in method. We're almost there. The fat is almost cut into the dry ingredients. I was kind of telling someone the other day that at one of my jobs, I was doing chicken and dumplings, and I was doing like drop biscuits on top. So the dumplings were going right on top and kind of browning, that kind of a chicken and dumpling. I don't know what you want to call it, but when I was doing that, I was just making a big batch of this right here. I just made the biscuit dough to this point, and then every day I would grab a few cups of it and just wet it with some buttermilk, and that was it. In the one I was using there, I had my sugar. I was using white sugar, so it was in here already. I wasn't using honey. I did honey today because I wanted to show you the honey trick. All right, so flour is cut in. I don't see any big chunks that are freaking me out or anything. Step one, sift dry ingredients together. Step two, cut fat into dry ingredients. Step three, add wet ingredients. Combine wet ingredients and add them on in, okay? So let me get a little spatula here, and I'm gonna hold back on a little bit of this liquid. I wanna kind of make sure I get the honey in there though. Whoa. But I just held back the tiniest little bit because I don't want this too wet. Now, if I'm doing drop biscuits, I mentioned chicken and dumpling. I was kind of just using a scoop and dropping those on top of the chicken and dumplings that I was doing. In this case, I want to roll these out, okay? So you'll have a rolled biscuit, a traditional biscuit, and then you'll also have what's called a drop biscuit. If you've never heard that, that's what it means. You'll just kind of wet it a little bit more so you can scoop it and then just drop it down and then bake that off. Okay, so let's get in here. I've just barely been tossing this mixture. Now, when we are making biscuits, we are not looking for gluten development. We used pastry flour in this thing. There's an indication that you really don't want to over mix this. I'm going to add the rest of this liquid. I can tell it needs it. So we are going to be really, really careful with how much we mix this. And I'm sure most of you guys have probably seen a recipe at some point in your life where they say, do not overmix. Hey, this is one of those recipes. They say that with pie dough. They say that with batters, pancake batter, muffin mixes. Do not overmix. We don't want gluten development. That's what that whole thing's about. Now I'm mixing this just until combined, and it's okay to have a little bit of dry ingredient in this. believe it or not. By the way, as I was cutting in flour, I was not developing any gluten, but right now I'm just going to give this the tiniest little splash more. It just seems a little wet to me. I started to say that gluten wasn't being developed as I cut the fat into the flour, but as soon as I added the liquid ingredients, the buttermilk has water in it, and that buttermilk is activating that gluten, and it is beginning to develop gluten. You don't develop gluten until the items are wet. Okay, I don't think I want to mix this much more. This still has some dry ingredient in there, but I'm just going to kind of incorporate that into the mix, okay? So I'm going to get in here with my hands, and we're going to get a little more flour. I got a setup here for rolling out, so I got to pull a few things over here. But that is essentially my dough right there, okay? Yeah. All right, so let me pull a few things over. Okay, so I got a sifter. I've got a rolling pin. One thing I like to do is just kind of coat my rolling pin with a little bit of flour. By the way, you never wash your rolling pin. You never want to get this thing wet. Only dry, only dry. When I clean a rolling pin, if it gets gummy, this is the tool for cleaning it. You see these plastic scrapers all the time. It's a bowl scraper, and it's meant to bend like that. And then when I'm cleaning a wooden rolling pin, this is the tool. I bend it around the rolling pin and scrape it like that, okay? So do not get your rolling pins wet, any of your wood tools, okay? Okay, so I threw a little bit of flour on there, got rid of it. It's nice to have a brush on hand when you're rolling things out, so I just have a little pastry brush here. I might need it, I might not, we'll see. I've got different cutters here. I might just do a couple of different ones. I've got some kind of fluted ones here. I think I'll do the next size down, and I've got a cutter right here that's just a plain round. That's kind of a large one. Yeah, I don't think I'm even going to use that. That's actually a plating ring. It's not even a biscuit cutter, but you can kind of use that. I think I'll just use this one size, and it should fit all. Okay, I'm going to put a little flour onto that guy as well, and I'm going to set him aside, and I'm going to get rid of the rest of that, get rid of this, and I think we have just about everything we need to start rolling out my biscuits. Now remember, we are not trying to develop gluten in this one at all. Getting flour all over my camera and everything. This is awesome. But so we're going to roll this out, and I'm going to do one little fold just to kind of demonstrate this. And also, I want to incorporate a few other ingredients in this. I'm going to throw down a little cheese and some chive, or actually scallion, in the middle of these biscuits. Okay, so you could just roll this thing out, cut them, and bake them off. I'm going to do what's called a fold in it, and that's going to create even more layering in there. You can do a bunch of folds in this. You can do 3 folds in it and roll it out and do a 3-fold, but it tends to start developing gluten. I'm not really fond of doing too much of that. So I'm just going to demo that 1 fold for you guys, and then we're going to call it a day on that. All right, Ms. Donnie's out there. Good to see you, young lady. Oh, yeah. We are demonstrating rolling out right now, and I'm going to throw down a little bit of flour. You don't ever want to throw down too much flour. My buddy Chef Adrian used to say, don't be a flour monkey. Just enough to get the job done, and that's why I like to kind of sift that down there. I'll get rid of this bowl in just a sec. Now, I've got this little bowl scraper. This is kind of how this one works. We kind of use it for this, and I would usually keep this, you know, if I had a pocket in my chef's coat, it would fit right in there. So I always had that when I was working a bake shop. I always carried these when I was working a bake shop. And by the way, we would get things in like plastic buckets, like raspberry jam or apricot glaze and things like that. And we would just cut these things out of there, cut up the lids and things like that, just to make these things. So we had it. Couldn't do our job very well without them, actually. All right, so the way to use a bowl scraper is you just kind of you tilt your bowl, you get on one side of the dough and roll it on out, okay? I'm gonna leave some of those dry ingredients back. Oh, I guess not. It's all coming along. And it's all out there. You can see it's fallen apart, right? It's barely holding together. That's what I want. I don't want these biscuits to get overworked, okay? So set this aside. Oh, I should say, people, do yourself a favor whenever you're doing doughs in a bowl. Don't just set this aside. It's just gonna set up like cement. So I'm gonna get this wet and give it a quick little scrub just so it's not a nightmare later. I'm doing that for you guys, okay? So here we go. Quick little rinse. Okay, so just rolling this out. is so easy to do. By the way, when we have these types of rolling pins, this is the one I want for biscuits, okay? Sometimes you'll have the dowel type rolling pins when you see those ones. Those guys are made for like doing pie dough, tart shells, things like that, where you could kind of be rolling with like one hand and kind of, you know, you can really steer it around with something like that. These are a little chunky for that kind of work, okay? But for a biscuit, I'll be honest, guys, for a biscuit, I tended to just do this for my biscuits. I really rarely even roll them out, but I'm gonna roll it today, okay? Again, you can kind of see it's barely holding on. I can see pieces of butter through the flour here, right? Those are gonna be flaky flakes, all right? And I'm gonna go ahead and roll it. Now, I just noticed that my dough kind of spread out, but it's not really floating. I guess it is sliding a little bit, but that's one of the things you want to check. So I just rolled it. It didn't look like it was moving much on the counter. I'll give that another try, and then I make sure it's moving. And I think I'll go this way now, just a little bit. It's really kind of breaking up. That's fine. And I'm going to go a little more. By the way, the more you roll this, the more it develops gluten. Okay, so there, I could cut this out right now and start baking them off. Maybe a little, I wouldn't roll them quite so thin, but I want to go out and I'm going to go ahead and just put a little bit of flavor inside on half of this and then fold it over. So a little bit of cheddar, a little chive on the inside. I didn't want to really blend it in. I wanted them to be a little bit kind of messy looking, kind of messy. So a little cheddar, and I'll throw it all in there. And not chive, I said chive, but these are scallions, green onions, as they are called, okay? And there's that, okay? Now, we could do a technique where we are folding this multiple times. I'm just gonna give it one fold because again, I really don't want to develop much gluten. Let me get my bench scraper for this job. It's a little bit wider than that one. And I'm just folding that over, okay? I'm gonna kind of pinch these sides together, kind of like locking it in. If you've ever made like a puff pastry or something, we'll do that little step. And now I've got it kind of squared off again. I got a pretty nice shape. And we're gonna go ahead and roll it on out. I wanna kind of move any cheesy bits out of the way. And before I roll, I'm gonna just toss a tiny bit more flour around, but not too much. I don't wanna be a flour monkey, like Chef Adrian used to say. Ooh, Chef Scott Rice is out there. He's a biscuit celebrity. I'm gonna get this just a little further down. It was just falling apart a little bit, so I just kind of pieced it together a little, but that's okay. And I think I'm ready to make some biscuits here. Let me do one more. They're just a little heavy. And I'm kind of feeling it to see if I have any high spots. And now I think I can go ahead and start cutting my biscuits, okay? What I'm gonna do here is kind of get rid of some of this excess flour, kind of messy. Push it off to the side. And I wanna kind of get a little space cleaned off here for a tray. I have a tray here. I've lined it with some parchment paper, and I've got a little oddball piece of paper. I had a oddball piece of paper in my drawer I wanted to use today. So, trick with the biscuit cutter, you want to get a little flour on there, and then we go straight down with this guy, and I don't like to turn it, okay? If I turn it, my biscuits tend to rise a little bit funky. And so in and out, and there's that little flaky center in there, okay? So I don't just do them one at a time. I'm going to go through all of them, pull it out, and then kind of lift them out. Biscuit cutters don't work like, you know, sometimes you'll see something like this. We wouldn't have any cutters, so someone would use a lid of something to cut things, but you have to poke a hole in it, otherwise it doesn't work. Again, cutting these, go straight down, don't twist. It rises kind of funky if you twist. And just as little waste as possible, I'm going to make a funky little, they're sticking to my cutter here. I'm going to make a funky little biscuit at the end with the rest of this. We're almost in the oven, guys. My oven, by the way, is preheated to 425. That's a pretty high temp for baking, by the way. You know, a lot of our preparations are happening, maybe some of them, you know, 375 or something. But with these biscuits, we want them to rise quickly before the exterior sets up. And as this is baking, I want to talk about leavening agents. What is it in different baked products that makes them rise, and how does that work, right? Why does it make them rise? So we'll have a little something to talk about while these guys bake. It's going to be awesome. They're only going to bake for about 12 or 15 minutes. There's a funky one. And then what I'm going to do with the rest of this, I can't really blend all this stuff back together too much because it's just going to get a little funky. So I'm really just going to kind of press it together. Again, the idea here is I'm not trying to work it too much, right? Also, in this particular case, I had that funky layer in there too. So if I just kind of press it together, that layer is going to kind of hold its shape a little bit. I think that's about it. You guys see how I just shaped it with my hands? A lot of times when I'm doing biscuits, I don't even use a rolling pin. I'm just shaping it like that. And let's get the rest of these guys. And we're about done. These last ones are going to be mutants. And I think I could probably put this last one together, but if I do, this is going to be real mutant. This guy's pretty ugly. There's our mutant. If I put this guy together, he's really just going to look crazy, right? And he's going to be pretty tough. He's not going to rise very well. Let's see, using a glass cut will work if you don't have a cutter. My thing with that, good point, Roberta, but my thing with that is like, there's no outlet for the air. So sometimes it's a little weird to do that, right? You probably know what I'm talking about. Let's see, do I ever just cut into squares instead of a round cutter? You can absolutely cut into squares or diamond shapes, really common with scones, because remember, this whole biscuit thing that you guys just saw, the scones work exactly the same, right? Pie dough works exactly the same. Measure dry ingredients, cut your fat in, add your wet ingredients, right? All of this stuff, you can kind of go different ways. You can cut them in different shapes, like scones. I'm sure you were familiar with that. I was mentioning earlier that I could sometimes add extra buttermilk so it's a little looser and do drop biscuits. So I just scoop them with a scoop, drop them down, and bake those off. And they just it's like a round, chunky, funky looking hump, right? And so I'm going to get rid of this, and we are going to go into the oven. We got to get cooking. Let me back up. I'm going into a 425-degree oven. Okay, it's a fairly high temperature. Any moisture inside from the buttermilk, from the butter itself, there's a little bit of moisture in that butter, that is going to turn into steam in this hot oven. That steam is trapped inside of that floury matrix in there. It has nowhere to go but up, and that biscuit is going to rise. That's where we get our rise. What are we talking about here? We're talking about leavening, okay? I want to talk about leavening while this is baking inside that oven. And before I do that, I got to clean up because I got this mess here and it's just going to drive me crazy, okay? I got to clean it. So bear with me for one moment. And I just got one of my bowls I was using. Get rid of this. And this won't take but a minute. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we are watching Industry Cooking Channel on the Industry Cooking community right now on Facebook. This will be edited up and thrown out on Industry Cooking Channel on YouTube. If anybody wants to kind of watch this again, or hey, you know, it's a great idea. Do you go out for a walk or something, put on your headphones and listen to it like a podcast? This is beautiful stuff. And I never stop talking. It's a gift. It's a gift. It's such a sad little show. Okay, let's see. Just wiping things down, and our biscuits are in. Now, by the way, these biscuits are going to take about 15 minutes, usually about the 12-minute mark on a lot of my baked goods. I'm going in there and I'm going to kind of swing it around, okay? So that's what I want to do. I'm going to set this guy for 12. And we're going to talk about leavening agents, okay? So when we're talking about leaveners, again, we're talking about the ingredients in baked products that are going to give them rise, okay? The most common one that we think about is yeast in bread, right? Yeast it kind of falls under a category that I would kind of refer to as like a biological leavener, okay? Things like yeast, things like sourdough levain, right? That kind of thing. Those are actual creatures, right? Or yeast is really more of a plant, but it's a biological organism that is going to create, well, CO2 gas, and it also creates alcohol. This is basically the waste products. This is like poop and pee for these little biological creatures, right? But we like this gas and we like that alcohol when we're making things like wine and other things, right? When we use yeast, yeast produces gas, and that gas is trapped in a glutinous matrix by, a glutinous matrix of flour in most of these products, right, of wheat flour. So when that gets hot, as I said a moment ago, it has nowhere to go but up, right? And those baked products are going to get that oven spring out of it. So things like yeast, sourdough, those are biological leaveners. Now, we didn't use any yeast in this recipe today. We used what I would call a chemical leavener. Okay, and so chemical leaveners are things like baking powder, baking soda, things of this nature, right? Now, what's the difference between those two, right? A lot of people usually ask that question. What is baking soda? What is baking powder? Baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, and then baking powder is basically the same thing with the addition of one other ingredient, okay? Now, I want you to, before I get into that, I want you to think back of like an old Brady Bunch episode where they made a volcano out of like baking soda and vinegar, right? You guys probably know this old science experiment, right? You mix baking soda, a base, with vinegar, an acid, and you're going to get a reaction from that. And that reaction, one of the things present in that reaction is going to be some CO2 gas. Again, CO2 gas is our friend. That's what makes our yeast doughs rise. So when we are using something like baking soda, if I have something like acid present in it, like today, I had buttermilk in there today, right? Buttermilk is very acidic, and that could be enough acid to activate the baking soda in there to create the gas that I need to make my biscuits rise, right? So baking soda plus acid creates CO2 in baked products. The CO2 gas, again, trapped in a floury matrix, and it has nowhere to go but out and up, right? And that's where we get our oven spring with those chemical leaveners. Now, so that was baking soda plus acid, right? Now, baking powder, as I said, is baking soda with a little bit of acid in it as well. But this is a powderized acid. If you guys have ever seen cream of tartar in the bake shop, right? Another name for cream of tartar is tartaric acid, okay? Tartaric acid is something that we get out of the winemaking process. If you've ever seen those little white lees in the winemaking, in a wine bottle, or little crystals in there, that's tartaric acid, or cream of tartar, basically forming in a wine bottle. And so this cream of tartar, it's an acid, but it's a dry acid. If I mix the baking soda and cream of tartar together, there's no reaction until they get wet. I add a little drop of water to it. It's like Gremlins. It just explodes, basically, right? So again, baking soda is used in like a biscuit recipe or something like that has acid in it. Maybe it's a lemon biscuit or something with buttermilk too, so it's super acidic. I wouldn't want like a baking powder in there because it's going to be, super acidic if I have baking powder, because it's got cream of tartar on top of everything. So that recipe, I might just use baking soda. Other recipes, they don't have any acid in them. Hey, I'll use cream of tartar in there, and as soon as milk or water or any other liquid, eggs, hit it, it's going to start reacting and creating CO2 gas. Differences between the yeast and this chemical stuff, the biological and the chemical leaveners, differences are they are going to have a kind of a rising time when you're using yeast, right? Since it's a biological organism, it needs time to kind of multiply in there and respirate, if you want to say, right? And create that gas. Whereas the baking soda, baking powder, as soon as they get wet, they're starting to kick out a little bit of CO2. I did have a buddy, the best biscuits ever were a coworker of mine named Juan in San Antonio, Texas. This guy made the best biscuits, I don't care, of anybody I've ever met. And he swore by putting the biscuits on top of the oven for a little bit of time to just kind of warm that dough. So when it did go into the oven, it was already kind of warm, it wasn't ice cold, and you would get that really nice oven spring. Okay, today I had to go right in there, but normally I might put my biscuits up and just warm them for about 10 minutes on top of the oven, and then I go in and I get a really big spring out of them, as opposed to having ice cold biscuit dough going in your oven, right? Let's see, so we talked about biological leaveners, we talked about chemical leaveners. Now I want to talk about physical leaveners, and physical leaveners are, I call it that, but really it's just we're doing something to the product to incorporate air or water into it, okay? So an example of water is kind of one thing that we did today was an example of a physical leavener when I put those flakes of butter in those biscuits and they're kind of encased in flour. That butter has a little bit of water in it, just a very small amount, but there's a little water in there. And when that gets hot, that water inside the butter is going to turn to steam, and I'm going to get a little rise out of that, right? That is a very good example of what happens in laminated doughs. When I'm talking about laminated doughs, we're talking about things like puff pastry, Danish dough, croissant dough, right? And those doughs have a layer of butter inside, and then they'll fold it, and that layer of butter is folded in thirds now, and then they fold it again, maybe in fourths, right? And they just keep on folding it until you've got layers of dough and butter and dough and butter and dough and butter and dough and butter, okay? When you roll out puff pastry with all of those layers of butter in it, you roll that out, you cut it, you put it into a refrigerator, I'm sorry, the opposite. You put it into an oven at a pretty high temperature, and the water inside that butter turns to steam. That's what makes puff pastry rise. If you think about it, puff pastry, there's no yeast in there or anything but the butter that you fold in. It only rises because you did the physical work to put that in there. And when it gets hot, it'll create steam and you'll get a rise. That is an example of something with steam. Let's see, here's another example of a physical leavener. When I'm doing a traditional French sponge cake, I am whisking up, like I get eggs and sugar kind of warm, and I'll whisk them up. Sometimes I put a little sterno inside underneath my mixer to get it all warm. And as that's mixing up and those eggs start to get a little hotter, they're able to capture and hold air a little bit more. Okay, we call this foaming in the bake shop, right? And so I am physically beating air into the egg, and then we gently fold dry ingredients into that. Dry ingredients hit the liquids in there, form a glutinous structure that's going to capture any air or gases that are in there. And then when I put that sponge cake inside, and also, by the way, souffles work this way as well. It's just air in there. There's no yeast or anything, right? Anything like a cake or a souffle, that air is incorporated, it's stuck inside this glutinous sponge, and when it gets hot, every single air cell in there is going to expand, and that's where we get the rise on cakes, that's where we get the rise on souffles. So that is what we mean by kind of a physical leavener in that case, okay? Another example of a physical is what we call pâte choux, or choux paste in the kitchen. And this is the little pastry shell that you see in cream puffs and eclairs, right? It's just kind of a little brown pastry. It doesn't taste like much. It's kind of eggy. It's like egg and flour and water, basically. But when you pipe that out and put that into an oven, it'll get a little puff, you know, you kind of work the gluten up in this recipe, so it's a little stretchy, and it puffs up, and the puffing is just the liquid, the water in the recipe from the water and also eggs in it. That is going to turn into steam, and this entire thing is going to puff up. And once they puff up, very important, you have to, there's not much structure here, so you have to kind of turn down the oven and let them kind of stay in there and dry completely out, so they'll hold that shape. If you've ever made cream puffs or eclairs and pulled them out of that oven before they get a chance to really dry through and through, those things will puff up beautifully. They look like $1,000,000, and you pull them out and they just go. So you got to puff them up and then just allow them to kind of dry out. You'll see moisture kind of condensing on the outside of that little pastry, and then it's done. Let me just kind of talk about why I'm so interested in pastry. When we're doing pastry work, there's literally like 90% of it is basically 5 elements, right? If you think about it, it's flour, it's sugar, it's eggs, it's cream or milk, and it's butter, right? A vast majority of what we do in the bake shop is those 5 ingredients. We could call it 6 and say chocolate, but I like to leave chocolate totally off to the side because it's a whole other animal. And a lot of the stuff in the bake shop, maybe we're just kind of, we are kind of just flavoring the chocolate or something like that. But the large bulk of it is just 5 ingredients. And it all boils down to how you manipulate those ingredients. I kind of talked earlier about knowing how ingredients act under certain conditions. When I get flour wet and I knead it, it develops gluten, right? When I put it into an oven, it firms up, it browns, you know, and I need to know, it provides structure. Flour can also capture air and hold it, right? And thus give me leavening, right? There are so many things to know just about flour, right? And the same thing happens with butter, with cream, milk. You know, what do those things do in a recipe? Why do we use those ingredients? What are they doing for us in the bake shop? As we move forward in these things, I'm going to have things to, you know, time where things are baking. There it is right there. We're just checking these biscuits right now. But we'll have times where things are baking or something like that, and that's where I want to kind of start talking about ingredients and hey, what do eggs do for us? Eggs give us structure, right? Eggs give us color when we bake. Eggs can capture and hold air, right? There's so many things we can do. We can separate eggs and make meringues out of the whites. We can use the yolks and make chocolate mousse out of those and aerate the whites and fold it in, right? There are so many different things that eggs do in the kitchen. Let me spin these guys. They're looking beautiful. A couple of them are mutants, I will say. And we're going to give them about 4 more minutes, and we're about done. Boom. So that's kind of the plan moving forward. Getting into kind of more baking techniques, mixing techniques, all of that great stuff, and also kind of incorporating ingredient knowledge and also tool knowledge and, little tips and tricks, Nobody on Food Network ever talks about how to clean a rolling pin with a bowl scraper, right? Things like that you just don't see on Food Network. That's kind of what it's all about. So I want to remind everyone that all of these videos are up on that YouTube channel, Industry Cooking channel. Go on over there, subscribe your mom to it, okay? Subscribe all the little chefs in your house to it, okay? It's a great channel. I got tons and tons of these shows. And like I said, this is something you could sleep to, right? And when you wake up in the morning, you'll be smarter about the kitchen, right? That's what I do every night. I listen to myself talking to myself, right? So get on over to Industry Cooking channel and check that out. Another thing you can do if you are into a little more of an interactive experience, go on over to that Industry Cooking community. Heck, you're there right now, okay? And join that group if you're not a member already, and join us every Monday for these Industry Cooking happy hours. They are a lot of fun, and it keeps me sane, and I feel like I'm laying down some true kitchen survival knowledge here, okay? It's not just about the fancy stuff. It's about, and it's not just about the recipes. It's about what's behind the recipe, because, face it, you can follow recipes your entire life and still never learn how to cook. Right. And so that's the whole reason I'm doing these things. I want to kind of have those conversations behind what's behind the recipe. OK, I always say it. I'm not a handsome guy, and it's all kind of a freestyle, freaky styley kind of thing, stream of consciousness coming at you and everything. But, that's part of the charm of the whole thing, actually, of this sad little show. So, OK, we're about 1 minute out waiting for these biscuits. So as I said, I have a little chili on tonight. These cheddar chive biscuits or cheddar scallion biscuits are going to be awesome with that. And I think they're pretty easy to make. It takes me forever to make this stuff because I'm yakking the whole time and I'm going off in all these different directions and everything. But hey, this is a quick and easy thing. Again, going over that cut-in method, the blend your dry ingredients, or sift them is a better word, right? Blend together your wet ingredients over here in another container, and then cut your fat into the dry ingredients, blend your wet in, don't overmix, okay? Stir until just combined. That's how they usually say it, right? Don't overmix, you're gonna develop too much gluten. I did a little fold in this. There is a thing where you can do the little 3-fold and turn it and do another 3-fold. A lot of people do this, I'm just not a huge advocate of it. Again, I want a really, really tender biscuit. Okay, let's see. Other things that we talked about. We talked about recipes and versus formulas. That idea that a recipe, in volume amounts, dry ingredients and volume amounts. I would never hand a recipe like that to someone. That's not what you're looking for. You want recipes that are explained in weights, right? Sometimes I should mention you'll even see your liquids by weight as well, because certain liquids weigh the same as water. So water, milk, and eggs all weigh 1 ounce equals 1 ounce on a scale. They all weigh accurately to a scale. So the volume measurement, 8 ounces of milk, water, or eggs, weighs 8 ounces on a scale. It's kind of cool how that works. There's an old saying, a pint equals a pound the world around. A pint of water weighs a pound on a scale. It's kind of cool, right? And so again, those 3 ingredients are water, they are eggs, they are milk, okay? Things like heavy cream, think about it, it's thicker, denser, right? It's gonna weigh more than milk will, right? Honey is super, super heavy. It's gonna weigh a lot more than water does, but water, milk, and eggs weigh 1 ounce you can measure out 1 ounce and it'll weigh 1 ounce on a scale, okay? Very, very cool. Okay, other things we talked about. We went over the leaveners. The flours, all of the different flours, the different levels of gluten, cake on the bottom, then it goes pastry, all purpose. After that, it was bread and then high protein. And I think that probably took us to the end. Let's check those biscuits. Yeah, I got a little color on them. It's mission accomplished. I might give them another minute, but you guys get the idea. So I was looking for kind of a sloppy little biscuit. Okay, they're barely cooked. They're super, super tender. I love a biscuit that's really, really tender like that. It's barely holding together to where, you know, the guest is eating it and they're just like, how did they make this so tender? They're a little bit sloppy. This one's kind of offset. And we get down to this other end, and here were the oddballs that I did. You can see they're kind of Frankenstein monsters at this end. Still edible, but it's not something I would want to put in a bakery case or on a plate or something like that. But these are going to go awesome with chili or, you know, Southern food or anything like that. It'd be beautiful having that sloppy cheese and green onion all sliding out of the center of that flaky biscuit. Okay, let's break one open just to look at it. You can see some flakes in there, and there is that one flake in the center. Super, super tender, thoroughly cooked through and through. I think it took me 14 minutes. Okay, I'll give it a little taste. And I'm not trying the cheesy part, just the biscuit part. Oh, delicious. Yeah, super tender, melts in the mouth. Okay, I'm very, very pleased. Okay, that takes us to the end. Let me do this. Oh gosh, biscuits, you know. Okay, that takes us to the end, ladies and gentlemen. That was a long one. Timing was a little weird at the end, I'm sure you can tell. But hey, it's a process, right? And that's what you get for watching a very sad show. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to YouTube Industry Cooking Channel. Don't forget to join the industry cooking community. Get over there and play around with other like-minded food people, and post your stuff, right? Post what you're doing in your kitchen. We all want to see it. We got some really cool stuff going on over there, okay? Outside of that, guys, always be true to your food, and do not forget the party is always, always in the kitchen. We will see you on the next one next Monday. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.